Dim on the gwir, I'll tell you all a bit of a story. I'll try and tell it to you correctly, and every word I say will be the truth. Only the truth, nothing but the truth. Yr hen o'r llwynt sydd yn y cornel, gan ei dad fedlywodd Chwedl, a chan ei dad fedlywodd y ag ar ei ôl. Fe gofiau cynta. The grey-haired old man in the corner heard a story from his father, and he heard a story from his father. And now I will tell it to you. Many hundreds of years ago, there was a young man who lived on a farm called Blaen Sawdde, on the banks of the river Sawdde, the upper reaches of the valley of the Sawdde, in the mountains of eastern Carmarthenshire, just on the edge of the Black Mountain. And he lived with his mother. His mother was widowed, his father was dead, and they kept cattle. And what he used to do every day during the summer months, at least, he would drive the cattle a couple of miles along the banks of the river Sawdde to the source of the river, right up high on the Black Mountain, a little lake called Llyn y Fan Fach. And there he would let the cattle graze. And then when he saw the sun beginning to come down, he'd gather the cattle together and drive them back along the banks of the river, back to the farm. And his mother would be in the kitchen looking out of the window and always happy to see her son arriving home safely. He'd go into the kitchen to have his supper, and every evening his mother used to say to him, well, pa fath o ddiwrnod ges ti heddi? Be nes ti heddi? Be ddigwyddodd heddi? Same thing every mother says when you come home from work. You know, what sort of a day did you have today? What happened to you today? And he never had much to say, because he did the same thing he'd done the day before, taking the cattle up to the lake and back. Really no news. Until one day, something different happened. He drove the cattle up to the lake as usual, and he didn't have much to do because the cattle just looked after themselves crazy. So some of the time he'd look back down the valley, he'd look up at the sky, he'd look at on the other side of the lake there's a bit of a cliff almost, you know, a Ban the high point of the Black Mountain at that point, and he'd look up there, and he'd look this way, and he'd look that way, and then he happened to be looking on the lake, and he saw something he hadn't seen before. And it was a girl. It was a beautiful young woman, and she was sitting on the surface of the water. That's what it looked like, not swimming in the water, sitting on the surface of the water. And he liked the look of her. And he wanted to get closer to her. And he wanted to have a chat, and he wanted to talk, and he wanted to get to know her. But she was in the middle of the lake, and he didn't know how to swim. And all he could think of to do was to offer him something, and all he had was the bread that his mother had given him for his lunch. So he took the piece of bread out of his pocket, and he held it out, and he smiled at her invitingly. Well, it was what he thought was an inviting smile. And then he looked as if she was smiling back, and she sort of drifted a bit closer to her, and she was holding out one hand, and he was holding out the bread with his left hand, and with his right arm, he was ready to take her arm to help her to sit next to him on the bank of the lake if she got close enough. But it was as if she was a bit shy, a bit timid, and she just got a bit closer, but she didn't want to get too close. And then she grabbed the piece of bread and then backed away a little bit. And she started to eat it. She was still smiling at him. But then when she started to eat it, she stopped smiling. And then she spat it out. And then she called out, Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana, which means your bread is hard. It's not easy to catch me. And then she started to repeat those words over and over again. Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana, Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana. And she started turning around and around on the spot faster and faster. Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana, Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana, Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana, Cras dy fara, nid hawdd fy nana. And it just disappeared.
So that's not bad. I'm so sorry. It's really embarrassing.
Just turn it off.
She called it late.
There was a strange ringing noise, and then she was gone. So when he looked for her for the rest of the day, no sign of her. So he gathered the cattle together when the sun set. He drove them back home. His mother was in the kitchen looking out the window. She could see her son coming home. He went in to have his supper, and as usual, she said, "Well, be ddigwyddodd I ti heddi? Be nes ti heddi?" And this time he had a story to tell. And he told her what had happened. Who could she be? And she said, well, falle taw un o'r tynnwys teg yw. Un o'r bobl, nid bobl y creaduriaid, chymod, chi'n gwybod pwy? Chi yn gwybod pwy fi'n meddwl, ynddo fe? Rheina sy'n byw, those creatures, one of them, the people, not exactly people who live, they say that they live at the bottom of the lake. It's not as if they get wet, they have their own land, their own universe, their own place. So the Tynnwys Teg, well, the fairy people, the fairy folk, these sort of supernatural creatures, people who live up in the mountains, maybe she's one of them. And well, he said, well, beth pwy bynnag yw i, dwi ddim yn licio dy fara di, mam. Whoever she is, she don't like your bread, mam. She said, oh, mam, you get it. So, perhaps they have, you know, they eat different things, you know, like people from different places. Maybe they don't cook their food. Maybe that's what it is. And she said the bread was too hard. Tomorrow I'm going to give you some raw dough. Just a mixture of flour, yeast, soggy, but maybe that's the sort of thing they eat. She lives in a strange land. Because these, the Tynnwys Teg, they keep cattle as well. Mae gwartheg gyda nhw. A pwy bynnag sy'n bia rhai o wartheg a Tynnwys Teg, bydd e'n gyfoethol. Whoever, these fairy cattle, because they also keep cattle. Sometimes you see them grazing on the side of the lake. And if a mortal man, if one of us can own the fairy cattle, then we will prosper. It's good luck. And, but anyhow, try getting her the raw dough. Was a try. Next day, he drove the cattle up the side of the lake. He looked, he wasn't just looking around this time, he was looking at the surface of the lake. And there she was again. So he held out this little soggy wet lump of dough. And he tried what he thought was an inviting smile. and she was sure she was smiling back at him when she got a bit closer. She was still a bit shy, like she didn't want to get too close, but she grabbed hold of it and she backed away a little bit and she started chewing it and she was still smiling, and then she wasn't smiling anymore, it was getting stuck in her teeth. And she spat it out and she went, Saith dy fara, ti ni fyna, which means your bread is damp. Wet, sorry, I don't want you. And she started to repeat those words over and over again. And she disappeared. And he thought, no, it's happened again. No sign of her for the rest of the day. He drove his cattle back home. His mother was looking out of the kitchen window to see whether she could realise what had happened. By the look on his face, he didn't look very happy. She went into the kitchen. Beth ddigwyddodd Joy? What happened this time? And he said, well, sy'n moyn licio toes am bwyd waith. Well, she doesn't like raw dough either. Well, the mother, she realised the young man obviously liked this girl and she wanted to do the best to help. So she had an idea. She said, tro hyn, fi'n mynd i bobi torth hanner corn. I'm going to bake a little loaf, but I'm only going to bake it a little bit. So it won't be hard and crispy like the bread I normally make, but it won't be just raw dough. It'll be speckly soft. A half-baked loaf. Gave this to her son. Next day, he went up to the cattle, with the cattle to the lake, and he saw the girl again. He offered her the half-baked loaf. She got a bit closer. Back over it. She was still smiling when she was chewing it. And she chewed a bit more, and she was still smiling, which was a good sign. She kept on smiling and chewing. And then she got closer, and she got close enough at last for him to take hold of her other arm with his other hand and help her to sit on the bank next to him. And then, for the first time, they had a proper conversation. And they sat and they chatted all through the afternoon. And then when he saw the sun was going down, it was time for him to go home, and he thought, well, it's now or never. So he asked her to marry him. At which point, she shot back into the centre of the lake. She started to turn round and around on the spot faster and faster and faster and faster, and she disappeared. And he thought, well, maybe that was a bit hasty. I suppose it's the first time I've met her. It's sort of our first date, really. You know, it's the first time we've had a proper conversation. So disconsolately, he gathered his cattle together, his herd, to go back home. And just before he went, he took one look back at the lake, and there she was again. But this time, standing on the surface of the water next to her, there was an old gentleman with a long grey beard. And he said, Llyn y Fan Fach, wi'n clywed eich bod chi eisiau priodi am y merch. Young man, I hear that you would like to marry my daughter. So was her father. And he stood up And he said, well, fi'n gytun, da fi ddim byd yn erbyn hyn, I agree to this, a wi'n mynd I roi gwaddol I chi, dwi'n mynd I roi anreg I chi, I'm going to give you a dowry, a gift. Cyment o wartheg a tynnwys teg o'n wartheg I, ac y gallech chi gyfri, mewn un anad, as many of the fairy cattle, of my cattle, as you can count in one breath. And he remembered what his mother said, whoever owns the fairy cattle will prosper. So he was getting ready to count. He said, when the young lady's father said, o'n un peth arall. Mae merch chi yn mynd I aros gyda chi, nesaf bod chi yn rhoi iddi 3 ergyd diachos. My daughter will stay with you until such time as you give her 3 blows. If you strike her 3 times. The young man was shocked to hear this stipulation. So he byth yn neud y fath beth, fi'n dwlu ar eich mer, fi'n caru eich mer, I'll never strike her. The father said, yeah, you're giving now. Yes, of course. But, Dad, you say that. But if you strike her 1 time, maybe she will forgive you and stay the 2nd time. But the 3rd time, if that happens, bydd hi'n dod yn ôl i'r llyn a diflannu o dan dyfroedd y llyn. She'll go back to the lake, she'll come back here, disappear under the waters of the lake. You'll never see her again, and she'll bring all the fairy cattle with her. Chi'n deall, you understand? And the young man said, dwi'n deall. Nawr, chi'n cael dechrau cyfri. Now you can start counting. So the young man, he knew that he had to count as many as he could to get as many fairy cattle as well. As he could, so he was going to take a deep breath. But before taking the deep breath, he thought he would just have a little drink of water. It was an unusually hot day. He took the deep breath, and he counted like this. 50, 50, 20, count. Which means 5, 10, 15, 20, 5, 30, 10, 20, 40, 40, 10, 15, 10, 40, 15, 40, 60, 5, 60, 10, 60, 15, 60, 80, 5 and 80, 10 and 80, 15 and 80, 100. And once he had done that, well, 100 beautiful fairy cows emerged from the waters of the lake, and arm in arm with the fairy girl, he started to drive his own herd and the 100 fairy cattle down by the banks, along the banks of the River Sauder, a couple of miles down to the farm where he lived. And when he arrived there, his mother was in the kitchen, looking out of the window, and she was happy to see her son arriving home safely, happy to see him looking so happy. She was happy to see the beautiful fairy girl on his arm, but she was happier still to see the 100 fairy cows. If you're a farmer's widow, you would be a practical person. And if 100 fairy cattle mean that you prosper, that makes you happy. And the next day they made arrangements for the wedding. And after the wedding there was a party, there was a celebration. And at the celebration there was singing. Magen nibiu hoine buenloi, Iebith hoine buenloi, Magen nibiu hoine buenloi, Ieithir cloid idonwyd, Ariarma chwla